Hey, welcome everyone to the Backyard Composting webinar. My name is Peter Dubois and I coordinate the Master Composter Recycler program here for Clark County, Washington. And quick question for you out there in the audience. Who out there has ever smelled a stinky compost bin? And even worse, have you ever seen or evidenced a rat around a compost area? Well, these are our two guiding principles. Hopefully by the end of this webinar, you can educate or contain or maintain your own compost bin with no odors and no rats. And I've been there too, so I know it's all trial and error, but let's get launched going here with our webinar. Thanks again for joining us. Well, the good news is the nose knows. And if you've ever sensed a rat, well, I know you know that too. I was called out on a stinky compost bin as the compost doctor. And we're going to talk about some of the things that went wrong here. And then we're going to dial in how to do things right. Well, they stuffed about 5 or 6 of these giant tomato plants at the end of the season just into their bin. And you can see they were trying to get a ratio right of these composting greens and browns, which we'll talk about more. But they just shoved in giant wads of newspaper. And as you can see, it just started to all decompose and mat. And they had put in entire lemons and potatoes. And the whole thing was a stinky mess. They tried to put this bottom on their bin, which I don't recommend. Some of these bins do come like that as an option. They still had evidence of rats because rats can get through and gnaw through if they really want to be somewhere. So I started to apply the technique that we're going to teach you today. It's called the SMART method. And you can see there in the bottom, I'm starting to chop up some of these materials into smaller pieces. And gradually I was able to turn this bin, add some brown materials I found on site. You can see some leaves there. And by the end, it actually was not as stinky, but for the folks who were walking within 100 yards when I was doing this work, boy, they knew what was going on and it wasn't something they wanted to be part of. So the saying, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, really holds true when you're composting. Build it right or maintain it correctly from the beginning, and you're going to have very few problems. So we're going to learn these objectives, and we're going to learn how to compost the smart way. As I said, this is a technique we're going to teach you. We know that many of you out there want to garden and become more proficient in that and grow healthier plants and healthier food, to be healthier yourself and our community. So we're going to talk about how to use that compost. And then in case you get into some problems, we're going to do some troubleshooting. There's also a live demonstration that will also send your way so you can see some of these practices in effect right out in the field. Okay, so there are 2 types of composting that we're going to talk about in a backyard bin. And there's active composting and passive composting. And both techniques work. We recommend both. It's really a personal preference. Often it's a lot easier to just start out the passive way, and we're going to talk about that as well. But here I am training some AmeriCorps members on how to build an active bin. This is also known as hot composting or batch composting, where you're going to gather up all your materials at one time and build your bin at once. Imagine about 100 gallons of material that you're going to need on hand to really get this going. That would be about 20 5-gallon paint buckets. So that gives you an idea of what you'd need to really get and dial in this approach. The amazing thing is it really works, and it works fast. Here we are about a week later. You can see the bins drop by more than 1/3. And those layers and those colors that you saw in the previous picture, they're really starting to turn and change. And 3 weeks later, you really can't even see what we had started out with and put in the bin. And so, what is going on here? Where did all that stuff go? And what's happening? So I want you to think about nature. In nature, nature's way is decay. Has anyone come across maybe a dead animal in the forest or the woods, and you can see the carcass, but there's absolutely nothing left? Where did that stuff go? Or if leaves fall off of a tree in the fall and you don't bag them up, and you come back several months later and they're gone. Again, where did that go? So nature's way is decay. And ultimately, that material in a forest or under a tree, it's going to become humus. That's what happens in nature. The kids, when I go tell them about this in school, they like to pronounce it hummus, which I always find funny. But it is humus, and when we do it in our own bin under these controlled conditions, especially using and employing our SMART technique, it's called compost. So we're doing exactly what nature does. We're just doing it a little bit faster and controlling it with our own techniques. So here we are 7 weeks later, and you can see that we basically have made compost. We harvested about 3 wheelbarrow loads of material. It's a little chunky, you can see, so we're going to use this as a mulch, and maybe a 3 to 4 inch layer. Spread that out over our gardens, maybe cover it with leaves or straw, and let it set there for the winter time to further decompose and process. So when the spring comes around, we've got beautiful soil that's amended with this compost. It's brought nutrients. It's also got holding capacity for those nutrients and water. It really is a magical material that is proven and effective and will make your plants grow healthier and stronger. And if you want a garden, you're going to need to compost. It just makes everything even better. Okay, so we talked about turning it real fast in about 7 weeks time, 8 weeks time. And we'll talk a little bit more about how many times you need to turn and some of those other things and how to put the stuff in and layer it. But I want to just quickly talk about passive composting, which I know a number of you just might have a pail sitting next to your kitchen sink and you're collecting your fruit and vegetable trimmings. Maybe the coffee grounds go in there, tea bags, eggshells. And it is material that can be turned right into soil and certainly does not need to go to the landfill. This is called passive composting. It's also known as cold composting. Some people refer to it as lazy composting. And I like to refer to it as the dump and run method. And this is simply where you take your pail, you walk out to your compost bin, you dump it in, and then you cover that with a brown, dry material. And we're going to talk about all those when we get into our SMART technique. And then you just repeat. And then about 6 months, 9 months later, at the bottom where it's had more time, you're going to have beautiful, rich compost for your garden. So let's get into the SMART method. It's an acronym, and it stands for size, moisture, aeration, ratio, and tools. And we'll spend just a little bit of time on each one of those. But we have built hundreds of piles. We've built them in workshops with participants. We've built them with AmeriCorps members. We've built them with volunteers. We've built them with schools. And if you employ these techniques with a little bit of changing things up as you turn and go, you're going to have some beautiful compost as a result. So size. If you remember that first bin that really went stinky and smelly, and they had just shoved all these giant things in there, we really do want to have smaller pieces, because in our compost bin, the main players of who's making this break down, the decomposers, are the bacteria and the fungi, the microorganisms that we can't see. And just like us, if we were to eat an apple and we put an apple in our mouth, if we could, it would be very difficult to break down that apple. But if we take a bite of it and we chew it, and then we have saliva that helps to break it down, eventually it's going to decompose in our system as well. And if you think about it, we put in all of this material and out comes something brown. And it's basically the same thing with composting. In that first bin that we built with the AmeriCorps, we had all these different colors, and what comes out is this dark brown, crumbly, beautiful compost. So I like to say clip, chop, chip, tear, rip. Of course, if you're just pulling up some weeds from your garden, you don't need to snip those into small pieces because those are going to break down pretty quickly. It's really the more woody, bigger textured stuff, and then a full apple, anything of a bigger size that just is going to break down quicker if you can get it into small pieces. And the bacteria, just like we do saliva, they secrete enzymes, and that's what goes on to these particles and starts to break down things. Okay, moisture is also critical. As we all know, water, we need water for life. And if you're gonna have just a dried out bin, like dry as the desert, nothing is gonna happen in that bin, and it's basically just gonna sit there. If it's too wet and soggy and drenched and sloppy and messy, then it's gonna go anaerobic pretty quickly, which means no oxygen can get into those pores in your bin. The bin is completely saturated, and you will know that because it will smell. And so again, one of the great things about composting is our compost bin teaches us when we're not doing it quite right. And if you think about if you've had kids, when they go from crawling to toddling and starting to stand up, that's when you start moving all the things off of your lower shelves. And then they get a little bit bigger and you need to move them off the bigger shelves. So the kids kind of teach you how to parent. The same thing is going to be true with your compost bin. It's a science, but there is a little bit of art to it as well. Once you get into it, it's a wonderful hobby. It gets you outdoors. You don't need to go to the gym anymore. You get some vitamin D, and then you're eating healthy food that you grew with your own compost. Very empowering, and we really encourage everyone to be doing this. We'd like to create a movement here in Clark County, and with the Clark County Master Composter Recyclers, we've got lots of volunteers and these workshops to help. Okay, aeration. I alluded to this a little bit. A lot of people think that you need to turn your compost bin all the time. And the fact is, if you build your compost bin correctly at the very beginning, if you're doing a big bin or hot composting, you can maybe turn it 1, 2, 3 times max and have compost ready to mulch onto your garden in 7 to 8 weeks. So we're not talking about a lot of turning. And if you're doing passive composting where you just dump your bucket and then cover it with your brown material, you really don't need to turn it all. But one of the benefits of turning is it gets you up close and personal with what's happening in your bin. If you start turning that bin and it smells like manure, like you've never smelled before, you know you got a problem and you're going to address it and fix it. Again, if you turn it and it looks like the exact same material you put in, then it's probably just too dry and you're going to need to increase the moisture there. So aeration can be done either with a pitchfork. It can also be done with any kind of tool that you can get in there to mix it up with. We're going to spend some time here on ratio. This is a very critical part of composting. If you're reading composting books, you might see a C to N ratio, which is carbon to nitrogen. And you might see numbers like 20 to 1, 30 to 1, even 500 to 1. Again, those numbers, if you're going to really try to dial in the science of composting, are very important and good numbers to know. But if you're just going to dabble in your backyard and start this process, all you need to remember is 1 part browns, 1 part greens. If you've got a pail of kitchen scraps, you need to put in a pail on top of that with brown material. If you've got a bucket load of greens, you're going to put a bucket load of browns. So the simple ratio is 1 to 1. And we're talking about browns, which are the carbon or the dry materials, to composting greens, which are going to be your wet and also your nitrogen materials. If you're going to build your active hot batch compost pile, you're going to just layer those materials, as you can see in this picture, green, brown, up until your bin fills up, which is typically about 3 feet. So let's talk about what some of those browns and greens are. Okay, so we've got several examples of browns here. We'll start with cardboard. That's certainly a good one. You would, of course, need to tear it up into 2 or 3 or 4 inch pieces. When we go out and do our live demonstration and you see what's happening in my compost bins, I often will have a layer of cardboard on top of my compost. It captures some of the moisture, and then it's easy to rip and add to my bin and then replace with other cardboard. So a steady supply of browns there. Shredded paper is fine to use. If you're going to use newspaper, that would need to be put into strips. In the bottom right, we have straw, a great brown, especially if it comes with manure, and we'll talk about that in our next slide. It is important to know the distinction between hay and straw. Hay has the seed head on it, and that's why it's very valuable for livestock, and people pay a lot of money for it. If you were going to add that into your compost bin, you could be adding weed seeds, so that's our concern. Straw, that piece is removed, and all you're left with is the actual structure, carbon material, which is perfect. And I left for last my favorite, which are leaves. And if you're going to compost in a bin with leaves, you do need dry leaves. And so you'll need a way to stockpile them, obviously, if you're going to be composting all year round, because the leaves only come in the fall. They can mat down. If you're putting a 3-inch layer of wet leaves, you can imagine that nothing's going to penetrate that, and it's just going to basically go sour on you pretty quickly. But my favorite reason, the reason I left it for last is, and we'll demonstrate some of this outside, you can actually just pile up leaves, 100% leaves, in a bin or a contractor or heavy duty type bag with some holes poked in it, and make sure it's got some moisture when you put it in there. And you can come back in 6 months, 9 months, a year, and that material is broken down by mold, and you're left with a rich, rich, beautiful leaf compost, high in minerals, perfect for potting soil, adding to your garden, mulching on top during the winter time. So I highly recommend. I go out throughout the fall and keep my eyes open whenever I see craft bags at neighborhoods or neighbors. I'll knock on their door, and I'll import probably 20 to 30 of those craft bags each year for my composting process. Okay. So our next piece are the greens, and up in the left corner is manure. You can use pretty much most manures: cow, horse, chicken, goat, llama, rabbit. We do not want you to use pet waste, which would primarily be dogs, cats, pigs, anything that are eating meats and have parasites and some other issues. It is also important to know with manure that there can be E. coli, so you want to get to know the source of your manure. And if you're going to grow a food that touches the soil, like lettuce or spinach, that you let your manure compost and cure for a good 3 to 4 months is the recommendation right now. To the right of that is our fruit and vegetable trimmings, which are the ideal material for composting. They break down fast. I can put in 15 gallons of that into a bin, and a week later it's gone. Then we go down to grass clippings, and if possible, and you have the ability to mulch with a mulching mower, you can keep your grass right on your lawn. It's 75% water. It has an NPK, nitrogen, potassium, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium of 422, I believe. So it's actually a fertilizer as well, and you don't have to fertilize as much. But if you do collect the grass, it is a great green for your compost bin. This would be one of those exceptions to make sure you do very thin layers, similar to the big wet leaves. If you put in a big layer of grass, it can really start to stink and mat up altogether. Weeds from your garden are great. Weed seeds do not break down in a compost bin, even if you are cooking it pretty hot. There are areas of that bin that are not going to get hot. So we try to keep any weeds out, or especially noxious weeds. You wouldn't want to put in anything like buttercup or bindweed, anything that's going to potentially be noxious. And you can either put that in the trash, or I have a separate pile that I just let that sit in, and then I never use that anywhere. I just let it decompose. And then of course coffee, which is a little confusing because it is brown in color, but in structure it's a wet material and it is a nitrogen. So that would be a great one. A lot of coffee shops, if you give them a bucket or stop by, they will give you this material. And it can be used directly right on your garden and around trees and shrubs and plants as a fertilizer mulch to begin with. So I'm a big advocate of coffee grounds. Okay, well, we're into our last slide, which of our acronym, we have size, moisture, aeration, ratio, and our last one are our tools and how we do this successfully. We've got a number of compost bins. Some of these we'll see, some of these I use. The one on the top, black one, we refer to as the Darth Vader. And the one next to it, which is also black, is a better one-piece product. And that is something you can get here locally. Right now the store is closed, but it's at Metro Paint on Swan Island. And we'll include that link for $59. And so that's a pretty good system. Both those, especially for the passive composters, if you just want to open the lid, dump your stuff in, cover it with your brown material, and repeat that process until the bin starts to fill up, or when you want to harvest your compost. That's great. The one next to that is a Seattle Composter. These are awesome. Sometimes you can find them online, any of these bins. If you go on FreeCycle, Nextdoor, Craigslist, is a great way to try to get these. If you're interested in getting one of those, it would be best to contact our program, Master Composter Recyclers, because shipping, they're made locally, but the shipping can be prohibitive if you're just going to order one. Pallets, great option, easy to find, free. The one next to that is a tumbler. That's an 80-gallon lifetime tumbler. We recommend that one because it is something, 80 gallons is something that, you know, an intermediate composter could fill up. These bins on the lower level are ones you want to probably fill up all at once so you can control the temperature and get composting. Next to that's a wire mesh bin. And if you're going to be shopping for that, it's a little confusing because at the home improvement stores, it's referred to as hardware cloth. And this would be a 19 gauge. We typically buy ours. They come at 25-foot lengths, so you can end up with 2 bins. You cut them in half, but you need about 12 feet. And we'll get a 4-foot section and fold 6 inches down at the top and 6 inches from the bottom to reinforce the bin and still have it be 3 feet. And then you can just use wire twist ties to keep it together. This bin would require typically a tarp and some bungee cords just so you can control the moisture levels, especially so it doesn't dry out in the hot summer or get completely saturated and drenched in our rainy season. And our final bin that we'll talk about here, and there's lots more bins, and if you have questions or want advice, feel free to email us at mcr@clark.wa.gov. Again, we'll be sending that information around in our follow-up emails. You can also just email or text me directly. Last one is the geo bin. I actually like this bin for storing my leaves, and it can be a pretty big size, but for actually composting, I found it to be a little flimsy. Some other tools that can really help you compost, especially if you're going to become more of an active composter and really try to turn around compost so you've got a good supply for your garden and your trees and all of your plantings. This RioTemp thermometer is a great way to know what's going on in your bin and to really track when and if you should be turning. Then there are pitchforks. In the lower right, lower left, excuse me, we have the screen. So you can actually screen out your compost, especially if you want to use that as a potting soil to cover your seedlings or put in a row when you put in your seeds. That's a good way to make sure you've got nice sifted compost. The middle is referred to as a wing dinger, and those are good for aerating if you don't want to move your bin, and we'll show you how you can actually turn your bin by moving the entire bin. And then a chop shovel I find to be very handy. Okay, so maintaining your bin, maintaining your tools, this is kind of above and beyond, but maintenance is a good rule of thumb, and I'm sure it gets back to our ounce of prevention, pound of cure theme. I do like to towel off or rinse off my tools when I'm done using them. We typically have a bucket full of sand, and we'll put in some kind of mineral oil or even a vegetable oil, and then dip our tools in there to keep them from rusting. So one of the amazing things about compost is, again, how it transforms things that were once dead into this living soil. And if you were to take a teaspoon of this compost or living soil from the systems that we use, in that teaspoon is over 1 billion, with a B, microorganisms primarily. And if you had 3 tablespoons, just to take it one step further and make a comparison, the number of organisms that would be in those 3 tablespoons would equal the same number of humans we have on this entire planet. So it's unbelievable what we're actually working with, and scientists are still learning about all the benefits. So when you're actually spreading this compost either as a mulch or in your potting soils or on your seeds or in your seed rows, you are inoculating your soil with life. I like to think of it as a prebiotic. The other amazing thing about compost is it actually has chemical charges that will attract things, and it holds minerals and nutrients and micronutrients and even water. And that's an actual scientific chemical attraction bond. And so you don't need to water as much, and you're also getting nutrients to your plants without bringing in fertilizers, chemicals, and other types of synthetic things. Okay. My primary way to use compost, there's lots of different ways, of course, is just to mulch. And if you think again of that analogy of the leaves falling from the tree and spreading out, it's being done in a thin layer. It's not like a 8-foot pile of leaves just falls and then miraculously disappears from under that tree. So when you have a thin layer on the earth or on bare soils, all of the organisms that are already in the soil and the earthworms, they come up, they're taking that. It's food, it's life, and they're bringing that back down into the soil. And then you have all of that available again for your gardens and your plants. You can also spread it around plants. You can spread it around trees. You can do 2-inch layer, 3-inch layer, 4-inch layer, whatever you need. Okay, if you are around your compost bin and it stinks, it might primarily will stink like manure, which is going to be ammonia, which again is nitrogen being released. And so that is nitrogen that you're not keeping in your compost. And speaking with some master gardeners around here, for the most part, the one thing we would be deficient in gardening wise is nitrogen. And so that is something that we are introducing into our gardens through our compost. And we certainly want to maintain that. So the ideal situation with most of these odor issues is your pile is going to be too wet. So you're going to need to turn it to get some oxygen in there, and most likely add some of your brown materials in thin layers to make sure that you absorb that and rebalance your bin. There are some other critters. I just want to make sure. These are fungus gnats on the left, and that was what actually called me in for that initial stinky compost doctor bin visit I had to do. The whole bin was infested with millions of these. And they're all doing their part to try to decompose and rebalance a bin and break that food down. You can see that we have some fruit flies. If you're going to leave rotting fruit with nothing on top of it, you're going to set up an environment for fruit flies. They're just coming and doing their job. So you may run into these things. It's just a signal that something might be a little bit off and you need to pay attention and fix it. There is an exception. If you open your bin and you find a creepy crawly mass of what looks like very grotesque maggots, these are very beneficial. And don't be alarmed. They are soldier fly larvae, and they actually are decomposing and taking care of things in a very rapid, fast manner. They typically will only work during hot months, and so you will not see these, or they will be dormant in the colder months. But don't be afraid of these. These are our allies and our friends. They hatch into a black, harmless fly that only lives for about 7 days. It doesn't have a mouth when it becomes a fly, and so it can't bite and it can't transmit any diseases. But when these are in their larva form, they do have mouths, and they're actually breaking down and eating and decomposing your compost pile. Okay, I did want to just do a quick shout out here. I had a bunch of citrus that wasn't suitable for my worm bins, and we'll be talking about that in our next webinar. And I put 15 gallons of this into our compost bin, and when we go out and do our live demonstration, you can see that in less than a week's time, they are completely gone and very hard to find and distinguish. And I have other photos that you can see on Instagram at composting.pete. So we do have some questions. We welcome any questions coming to us. We'll do our best to help you become a successful composter. We definitely want to make sure you comply with those 2 principles we talked about: no stinky, smelly piles, especially because your neighbors won't be as neighborly, and not having any kind of food attraction for any types of nuisance, especially rats. So some of the questions that just come up for us, and I'll just handle these quickly, and then we're going to wrap up our webinar and head out to do our live demo, is what about inks from papers? And typically with newsprint, you have soy-based inks, and so that's going to be fine and no problem, will break down in your bin. When you're talking about billions and billions and billions of these critters feasting on the greens and browns we put in, feasting on each other, it's a food web, a free-for-all feeding frenzy that's going on in your compost bin if you give it the right conditions. And within that breakdown of all of those compounds into these building blocks of humus, a lot of these issues go away. And you've heard probably of fungus that can attack, break down rubber tires and can deal with oil spills. These are amazing creatures that can really quickly evolve to break down their food stocks and feedstocks. We do have a couple exceptions. You know, with newspapers, you probably don't want to put in your glossy papers, primarily just because we don't. You probably could. And cardboard, we typically try to just use the brown, plain ones, not the slick like you'd find with a brand new TV. Again, it's all a matter of personal preference. Okay, will your compost pile catch on fire? We do have this question come up every once in a while. And in a small compost bin, your compost pile will not catch on fire. Now, there are situations where they have giant windrows, they call them, where they're composting thousands of tons, and those can catch on fire. Okay, just a few more questions and we'll be on our way. Should I add commercial activators? Folks sometimes will go out and they'll buy bone meal, they'll buy blood meal, they'll put that on their compost bin. That's like a big rush of nitrogen. Everyone feasts on that, and then those critters have no more food, and so they die. It's like the buffet has disappeared, and everyone's still hungry, and there's no more food. So we don't recommend that. There's a natural activator that you can use, and actually a book written about it with urine, and so that is an option as well if your pile's not heating up and you need to get something going. It's actually pretty good to use with leaf piles, because that's a pure brown, and that will speed up the process. Okay, can you plant straight into compost? You can, and certain things love to be grown in compost, and I'm sure you've seen pumpkin, squash coming right out of a compost pile, tomatoes. So that's all going to be, again, learn and trial and error, but we have had great success growing in straight 8 to 12 inch depths of pure compost. And then will weed seeds be killed? We touched on that briefly. If you send it out to a municipal giant composting facility, they hold that at high temperatures of 140 degrees. They're turning it so every piece gets cooked and they can be weed free. In our backyard bin, not so much. So be careful, what you put in is what you get out. And that's one of the beauties of home composting, is you know what you've got. And if you're putting in wonderful items that you've collected yourself, you're going to get great compost. Okay, well, that is the end of our presentation here, and we are going to go out live. I really appreciate everyone coming, and happy composting to you all.